Hello, and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host, Rob. Today we're going to be completing our series on clerics. This is going to be part 5 of the series, and we are going to be covering all the domain spell lists for the non-player's handbook subclasses. In the last video, I accidentally put part 5 on the thumbnail, but I got 4 in the description, and I said 4 in the actual video itself. So everything else is right, and it's, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, as they say. So this one will have the correct number in the thumbnail as well. So I wanted to say though, before we get too deep into the video, kind of what I mentioned last time, that just because your subclass might have really strong spells or weak spells doesn't mean the subclass as a whole is particularly strong or weak. The domain spell list is only one of the cleric subclass features, and a lot of times a class will have really strong features and a weak spell list, or it'll have a really strong spell list and maybe weaker features. So, remember to evaluate the whole class as a whole. We're only looking at the spell list here, so don't, base everything off my opinion of the spell list, right? Take a look at the entire class, see if it's something you think you're going to like. However, I will say that at the end of the day, you are a cleric, and clerics are pretty awesome in 5th edition, so you'll probably be fine no matter what your choice was. So we're going to start with the Dungeon Master's Guide with the Death Domain Cleric. And technically this is an NPC only one, it says, but I don't have a problem with players playing Death Domain Clerics. A lot of people don't. They don't seem like they're particularly overpowered compared to other other domains, so I think it's fine there. And just on a different note, I think that there's a lot of cultures, like take the Egyptians for example, who had very different views on death than other cultures, perhaps, right? They might see it as a journey to a better world. They might not think that death is necessarily a bad thing, or they might have different views or whatever, right? So I don't think that Death Domain Clerics have to be evil. And just on another note, Death Domain gods tend to be key in every pantheon, right? Even if they're evil, every pantheon has a death god in it of some sort, right? So the idea that players can't worship that just kind of bothers me a little bit, so I have no problem with letting players do it. Anyways, let's jump into the spell list. At level 1 we have False Life and Ray of Sickness. False Life, I'm not really a big fan of this spell. I like it as the Warlock invocation, where you can use it infinite times and doesn't use a spell slot. That's great. But having to use a spell slot when I've only got a couple, not so much. However, having just said I don't like it much, I will make a case for it at level 1 as a circumstantial spell to consider. And that's mostly because a lot of party wipes happen right at 1st or 2nd level, because you have a smaller hit point pool, you don't have any good recovery tools, you've only got a couple spell slots, right? So if you use one spell, one fight, and then you healing word the paladin when he goes down, and then he just gets hit and he drops down again, now he's making death saving throws, and you don't have any other spells to your 1st level. So the idea that you can have that extra hit point buffer on yourself isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if you only have 9 or 10 hit points. Having 5 to 8 extra hit points is pretty good at 1st level. But like I said, the fact that it's a 1st level spell slot when you only have a few spells, the fact that it's not just a guaranteed 8 hit points, you could roll 1 and get 5 hit points, and not that 5 wouldn't help, it's just I'd rather probably cast Bless, to be honest, with my spell slot. Ray of Sickness, I kind of like. There are a few problems with it, but number 1, let's talk about the good things, which is that it does its damage regardless. If you hit the target, you're doing 2d8 damage. That's pretty good for a 1st level spell. And there's a chance that you're going to poison them, giving them disadvantage on their attacks, which is now even better. And even if they make their saving throw and don't get poisoned, they still take the damage. So that's pretty good. I think the damage for a 1st level spell is pretty reasonable. So the downsides though are that you have to make a hit roll. You could miss, right? And if you do hit, you do the damage, and they get a saving throw to avoid the poison effect. So now you need a hit roll to hit, and a saving throw Constitution save at that for the spell to take full effect. And that gets a lot trickier. So if you just want to use it as a source of hey, I'm going to try to do some damage with this spell, and maybe we can get disadvantage. Like if you use it as a comparison to maybe Guiding Bolt, perhaps, except instead of giving somebody on your team advantage, you're going to try to give the enemy disadvantage. I think it's decent, but again, it's not a spell that I'm probably going to be casting a lot at higher levels. It's probably just going to be a first, second level, and that's probably about it. So moving on to level 3 spells. Well, Cleric level 3, so second level spells. You get Blindness, Deafness, and Ray of Enfeeblement. Blindness, Deafness, I really like. The fact that it's a concentration-free debuff is really rare. And Blindness condition is pretty debilitating. You know, advantage to hit them, disadvantage for them to hit anything else. It's pretty nice. Now, it is a Constitution save as well, and monsters tend to have pretty good Constitution saves. But it scales well. It's no concentration. I think it's pretty good. Ray of Enfeeblement, again, it's another one of these debuffs, and it's not that it's a bad spell. Like maybe you're fighting something that you think is going to hit pretty hard, like an ogre or something, and you're only like 3rd level, right? Something like Ray of Enfeeblement isn't a bad call. It halves their strength-based damage. It basically just gives everybody in your party resistance, essentially. But again, you need to make another hit roll with the spell in order for it to be effective. And, you know, I kind of feel like on a lot of these type of spells, the fact that I'm having to use a spell slot, I might miss. There's no, like the thing with a buff is that the buff is going to work, right? Like if you compare Bless versus Bane, I'm going to cast Bless on myself and some party members. It's always going to work. There's no saving throw. There's no hit rolls. We just all get that extra D4. I cast Bane, which is essentially the exact opposite, but they all get a saving throw. What if one of them makes it? What if all 3 of them make it, right? So it's the fact that there's a saving throw involved or a hit roll involved automatically makes a spell less successful than one that doesn't have those conditions, right? So it's not that Ray of Enfeeblement is a bad spell under certain fight conditions. If I know they're using strength, but like a lot of enemies might be using Dex as well. So I mean, it is kind of a more circumstantial spell, I think. Clerical 5 though, we get Animate Dead and Vampire Touch, and Animate Dead is a spell I really like. I've talked about it before. There's a lot of ways to use those animated skeletons or zombies. They can help you in combat. They can carry stuff, you know, for those times when you kill the dragon and the dungeon master's like, oh, well, now how are the 4 of you going to carry out all the loot? And like, actually, I'm just going to animate all those skeletons we saw back in the other room there, and they can help us. And, you know, that's pretty handy. It's also nice to be able to send them down the hallway ahead of the party, so if there's any traps, then that it hits your undead summoned creatures instead of, you know, you, which is always way worse. You don't want to get hit. So I think it's pretty good. Vampiric Touch. Again, you do some damage. There's some healing, but I don't know. It's another one of these like kind of situational spells where I'm sort of on the fence. Where like if I need a heal, I'd rather just heal myself because then I know it's gonna work. I don't have to rely on the spell or on this spell. So, you know, I'd probably just rather do that. And, you know, if you're looking for damage, like, compare Vampire Touch versus Spirit Guardians, you know, like, I mean, not even a contest. But like I said, there are times when, you know, the fact that it's kind of like you can damage them and heal yourself, I mean, there might be circumstances where you want it. But overall, I'm not the biggest fan of the spell. Level 7, Cleric level 7, you get Blight and Death Ward. Blight is pretty decent damage. It's got some range on it. Saving throw for half. Again, not the worst thing out there. Noticing a lot of Necromancer spells on this spell list, by the way. Death Ward I like a lot, though. The fact that there's no concentration, lasts 8 hours. Very handy spell. Cleric level 9. I need to pick up the pace here a little bit. We get Anti-Life Shell and Cloud Kill. And I think these are probably, with the exception of maybe Animate Dead and Blindness Deafness, these are probably the best spells on the spell list. And I like Cloud Kill especially because it's not something you normally have access to. So I quite like that about it. Anti-life shell, that's very circumstantial, but this is exactly where I want it then, is on my domain spell list, right? So I don't have to have it prepared. If I think we need anti-life shell, I'm like, oh, hey, I got that on my domain list. It's always there if I need it. As for Cloud Kill, I mean, Cloud Kill used to be just a ridiculously good spell back in the day when it was like basically save or die, essentially. Not as strong these days, but clerics in general don't have like a lot of good AoE spells, and I think Cloud Kill is at least decent enough that I kind of like having it on the list. Anyways, moving on to the Forge domain, and Forge domain I think has a very good spell list. So unlike the Death domain, where I think it was kind of a weak list with a couple standout spells, but overall kind of not so great, Forge domain has some pretty good stuff. So Cleric level 1, we get Identify and Searing Smite. Identify we don't really need these days. You can just identify things while taking a short rest with them. As long as they're not cursed, you'll be fine with that. Searing Smite, not a bad spell at lower levels. Once I get higher, I'm probably going to be using like a spiritual weapon or something instead. But, you know, at level 1 and 2, it's okay. It's just something I'm not going to use much beyond that. But at Cleric level 3, we start getting Heat Metal and Magic Weapon. Magic Weapon, again, at level 3 is pretty nice to have. But once everybody in the party has magical weapons, we don't really need it much. But, you know, you might not have magic weapons until level 5 or 6. You know, that can be a rough stretch, right? So having the spell always prepared on your domain list, kind of nice. Heat Metal, of course, is an excellent spell. I love Heat Metal. Especially if you're fighting like humanoids that tend to wear armor a lot. Heat Metal really shines. Cleric level 5, you're going to get Elemental Weapon and Protection from Energy. Protection from Energy, we'll talk about that one first. Again, it's a circumstantial spell, not really the kind I usually like, but again, the kind I like to have on a domain list, because if I need it, then it's going to be there. And it is very, very good if you're fighting the right kind of foes. It's just, I don't want to have that kind of spell prepared, taking up one of my slots usually. I'd rather have it on the domain list, so that's pretty much perfect in my opinion. Elemental Weapon, again, very nice spell. I'm probably going to cast it on somebody in my party who has multiple attack, just to get more mileage out of it. I'm probably not going to use it on myself, but you know, that's okay. Nothing wrong with that. Level 7, we get Fabricate and Wall of Fire, both of which are pretty decent. Fabricate, probably not something I'm going to use in combat a lot, but although you never know, you might have more clever uses for it than I do. But still a pretty nice spell to have. Wall of Fire, I've talked about this one before. I quite like Wall of Fire, even though it fails the basic wall test of not being able to keep things out. I do like the fact that I can like use it to obscure things and like potentially block spellcasters from having line of sight on us, give archers disadvantage, that kind of thing. And the damage is pretty decent too. And the damage really starts to shine when you have party members or yourself with like forced movement abilities. So I've told the story plenty of times before, but I'll just mention it really quickly here. In one campaign we were in, my wife was playing a wizard, and my friend Cody was playing a warlock with Repelling Blast. And my wife would cast Wall of Fire, and when things came through, Cody would Repelling Blast them back through the wall again. They'd have to come back through and take more damage, and they were very, very effective together. So Wall of Fire is decent on its own. It starts to really shine when you have like the ability to push things back through the wall or pull them towards you. Either way, right? Level 9, Cleric level 9, of course, Animate Objects and Creation. And on Animate Objects, I like a lot. Using it on things like silver or copper coins or other things that are essentially worthless by the time you're 9th level. And then just using them for tons of tiny objects, attacking and doing lots of damage. If they hit, the damage is staggering. So that's usually the best way to use it. Not necessarily animating like giant statues and stuff like that. Just animate a whole bunch of tiny objects. And like I said, having a bunch of coins, that's something your party's probably carrying around anyway. So if your DM's like, oh, well, do you happen to have 10 tiny objects? You're like, yeah, we got a whole bunch of coins. We got 12,000 copper coins for some reason that we've been carrying around. animating 10 of them. So that's basically it for the Forge domain. Like I said, I think it has a very strong spell list. I like it quite a bit. The Grave domain, we get Bane at level 1 and False Life. So we already talked about False Life. Bane, I kind of mentioned Bane actually too. It's not that Bane is a bad spell, it's the opposite of Bless, and Bless is a great spell. So, you know, like I said, I'd rather not have a saving throw involved and just automatically buff my allies, right? Moving on, Cleric level 3, we have Gentle Repose and Ray of Enfeeblement. And Gentle Repose is pretty decent. The only thing is, you get Revivify at level 5. And the main purpose of Gentle Repose, in my opinion, is because your Cleric didn't have Revivify prepared. So now somebody dies, and you're like, oh, we can't res them. We'll cast Gentle Repose on them. Now we've got time to take a long rest, swap out our spells, and revivify the guy. Hopefully. So, yeah. Gentle Repose, like I said, it's pretty circumstantial. It's one of those spells you hopefully never need to have. Having on your spell list isn't the worst thing ever, but I'd rather just have Revivify, which I get at level 5. You also get Ray of Enfeeblement, like I said. We already talked about Ray of Enfeeblement before. No, I should say there. Level 5, Revivify and Vampire Touch. So Vampire Touch we already mentioned earlier as well. Revivify, this is absolutely perfect. This is exactly what I want on my domain list. Because Revivify is one of those spells that you kind of feel like you have to have prepared in case anybody dies, but hopefully nobody ever dies and you never ever need it, which just kind of feels bad sometimes. But having it on your domain list means you don't have to have it prepared. It just lets you dig a little deeper into that domain list, and you don't have to worry about it. You just, you know, make sure you have a 3rd level spell slot available. Level 7, Blight and Death Ward. Already mentioned both of those. And at level 9, we get Anti-Life Shell and Raise Dead. We already talked about Anti-Life Shell. Raise Dead, basically just an even better version of Revivify. Nothing wrong with that. If I didn't have both on my spell list, I would be perfectly happy to just have Revivify. Having Raise Dead also kind of makes Revivify a little less useful, but, you know, it is what it is. Overall, still a pretty good spell list. Or at least decent anyway. I feel like the Grave Domain has some really nice features. The spell list is kind of hit or miss. Moving on to Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. The Order Domain. At level 1 we have Command and Heroism, both of which are pretty handy. I mean, Command, I wouldn't say it's super powerful, but it is one of those save or suck type spells where, you know, if they miss a saving throw, it can be very influential in the battle, and not a lot of 1st level spells really do that. So I feel like Command is at least adequate, and Heroism is pretty good. Level 3 we get Hold Person and Zone of Truth. And Hold Person especially, as a 3rd level spell, not necessarily the best, but like I said, it scales very, very well. So that's pretty nice. And like the paralyzed condition is just so debilitating, giving all your allies advantage, auto crits if you hit, that it is one of those save or suck spells where if they make the saving throw, you just feel like you just wasted a lot of time and a spell slot. But if they fail, it's pretty much game over. And so, you know, I kind of like that. Level 5, we have Mass Healing Word and Slow. Mass Healing Word is also pretty handy. I've mentioned before, the only problem with Mass Healing Word is that a lot of times there's only like one guy who maybe took a lot of damage. You got one guy who took a lot, maybe a couple other people that got hit once each, and they don't really need it as much. But, you know, sometimes you have 2 guys that go down in one turn, like if half the party fails their saving throw against a fireball or something and all get knocked unconscious. This allows you to like get them all back up in the fight with one spell. That's pretty handy. So I feel like it's at least a pretty decent spell to have. Again, bonus action to cast, so it's not like, you know, it's not bad by any means. Slow, of course, is an amazing spell, and it's one that normally isn't available for you. So having that on your spell list is just absolutely perfect. Slow is a great, great spell. Between the fact that they can't use multiple attacks, or can't use like bonus action or a reaction, they can only use one. Lowers their armor class, lowers their move speed. Shit, it's just amazing. You can hit multiple targets with it. Level 7, Compulsion and Locate Creature. Compulsion's pretty handy. Someone's got to be kind of clever with ways to use it, but I find it's pretty good. Locate Creature is very specific. I think we've cast it like maybe once or twice ever in all the games I've played. There's probably been more opportunities where we could have cast it. We just didn't think of it. Or, or maybe there's like other clues in the adventure. So you're like, oh, we've got to put the clues together. How do we find this thing? It never occurs to you that we could just use a spell slot on it sometimes. But under the right circumstances, I suppose it's one I might use. It's just, it's not one I'm thrilled about having on the spell list. Let's just put it that way. Level 9, we get Commune and Dominate Person. Commune, very nice divination spell to have, and Dominate Person, just a very nice spell in general to have. So, not a bad spell list. Pretty good overall, I'd say. Moving on to the Peace domain. At level 1, we got Heroism and Sanctuary. Both really nice spells. Nothing to say there. Level 3, we get Aid and Warding Bond. And Aid is a phenomenal buff spell for only a second level spell. It's just awesome. And Warding Bond, that can be a little dangerous sometimes, but overall it's a pretty good spell. Not one I see used a lot, but, under the right circumstances, if you think it's going to be a really tough fight and you want to kind of like spread some of the damage around, then I think it's actually pretty good. Level 5, you get Beacon of Hope and Sending. Beacon of Hope is, right? It's one that I find is really good if you have 2 healers in your party. But with only one, I'd probably just rather use a third level spell slot on healing somebody rather than using a spell to buff my healing. Sending is pretty handy though. Nothing wrong with that. Level 7, we get Aura of Purity and Autolux Resilient Sphere. Aura of Purity, again, I have mixed feelings on it. It's not that it's necessarily a bad spell. It's just that by now, like, you're getting into 4th level spell slots. I mean, that's not exactly cheap these days, And I'd probably just rather have something like Aura of Vitality, which is only a 3rd level spell, not a 4th. And, gonna like buff up hit points and stuff. However, I have mentioned before, one nice thing about Aura of Purity is that you can kind of like use it reflexively. So once you see that, oh hey, we need to like start dispelling a bunch of this stuff, you could use Aura of Purity under those circumstances to like retroactively like start removing debuffs on your party, and it can be pretty handy in that circumstance. So having it on my spell list isn't really a bad thing. I'd way rather have it as a, on my domain list than having it prepared. Because like I said, if it's a circumstantial spell and those circumstances come up, then that's good. If they don't, then you just wasted a prepared slot. So, having it on the domain list is the way to go probably. Autolux Resilient Sphere. There's a lot of like really clever uses for this spell to like save somebody from going down or something like that. You can use it as like a type of like containment to try to trap something, although it's not always dependable. But overall, it's a decent enough spell. I don't mind it. Cleric level 9, we get Greater Restoration and Rary's Telepathic Bond. So just in case Sending wasn't good enough, Rary's Telepathic Bond is basically just telepathy. You're like the X-Men, coordinating everything through Professor X. However, I find a lot of game tables already operate like Professor X and the X-Men, so that does kind of make the spell a little redundant. But if you have a stickler DM who's like, hey, you guys, don't know what each other are thinking, then you're like, oh, actually, we can know what each other are thinking, though. I just have to cast a spell. So, under those circumstances, it's nice to have. Greater Restoration, of course, that's basically perfect. That's a spell you're probably going to use quite a bit. And again, it's one I don't necessarily want to have prepared, so I'd rather have it on my domain list. Otherwise, I probably will have it prepared and Hopefully never need it. And finally, that brings us to the Twilight domain. The Twilight domain, I think, is also a pretty good spell list. In fact, it's just a pretty good subclass in general. So, starting with Cleric level 1, you get Fairy Fire and Sleep. Fairy Fire is an excellent debuff. It's one that, it's one of those first level spell slots when you could use that spell when you're level 1, you could use it when you're level 8, you could be using it when you're level 15 or 20, and still feel pretty good about that first level spell slot. I mean, sure, you probably have better stuff by 20 to be casting, but you're probably not going to be casting that with a first level spell slot. And Fairy Fire is just something like, especially when you're high levels and you're like, oh, I could just use a cantrip, or I could just Fairy Fire them all. Why not? Help us kill this stuff even faster. Sleep is one of the best spells in the game when you're first level and second level, and by third level you're probably starting to see its maximum usefulness. So having it on your spell list isn't great for a higher level campaign or even a mid-level campaign, but it is a really nice addition at first level because it's a spell clerics don't normally get. Level 3, Moonbeam and See Invisibility. Moonbeam, decent enough. See Invisibility, again, circumstantial. If something's invisible though, I want to have it on my domain list. I don't want to have it prepared, because what if we never fight something that's invisible? So having it on my domain list, that's the way to have it. Level 5, Aura of Vitality and Leomund's Tiny Hut. And both of these spells are amazing. So, yeah, both great pickups. Now, you might have a party with a wizard in it who has Leomund's Tiny Hut and he can cast it as a ritual. That's even better. But, if you don't, maybe your party is a sorcerer or a warlock or somebody else and they don't have the ability to cast ritual spells, perhaps. This is the way to go. Aura Vitality, of course, is just a great healing spell in general, especially for out of combat, but even in combat, it's really nice. Level 7, we have Aura of Life and Greater Invisibility. Aura of Life, I'm not as big of a fan of. I've talked about this spell before, but I just kind of feel like it's a little underwhelming for this level. But again, it is circumstantial. If you're fighting the right kind of enemies, it might be, draining hit point maximum and stuff like that, then you might want Aura of Life. It's one that I would definitely prepare if I knew I was going into, Plane of Shadow or something like that, or, something like that, or maybe we're going to be fighting Orcus or something. You might want to have Aura of Life prepared. Greater Invisibility, though, is just an excellent spell. And one of the nice things about Greater Invisibility is that this is a combination that Bard in my last campaign exploited endlessly. He took Counterspell as one of his magical secrets. There we go. And he would cast Greater Invisibility on himself so he could make his attacks with advantage, but also so that he could cast spells, and unless the enemies could see invisible, they couldn't counterspell him. So that was pretty excellent. Meanwhile, he had Counterspell, and so he could counterspell them, and they couldn't even do the whole counterspell because they couldn't see him. So Greater Invisibility, excellent spell in general, really good on spellcasters. Level 9, Circle of Power and Mislead. Both these spells are decent. I don't think they're game changing, but they're not bad. And overall, I just feel like the Twilight domain has a pretty good spell list in general, with things like Fairy Fire, See Invisibility, Aura of Vitality, Leomund's Tiny Hut, Greater Invisibility. Those are, most of the real big standouts for me. So anyways, that concludes our series on clerics, finally. My next video, I want to actually take a look at a class we have not talked about on this channel at all, which is the Artificer. Partly because I wanted a chance to see them in action, and the current campaign that I'm running right now, we have an Artificer in the party. So I finally had a chance to see him to at least a decent level and kind of get a look at how he's playing in the class. So we're going to take a look at the Artificer next week, and then I don't know if it'll be right away afterwards, but we will definitely look at some multi-class videos using Artificer, or at least one or two anyway, because I like multi-classing, And Artificer is one we have not used at all so far. So, you know, we'll have some new type of ideas coming up right away. So that'll be hopefully fun and interesting for everybody, myself included. But anyways, that's everything for this video. So feel free to, you know, subscribe, like, ring the bell for notifications, all that stuff. And as I always say, most importantly, leave me your comments in the comment section. I look forward to reading them. And thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time. Bye.